Welcome to week 3 of Regenerative Leadership. This week we're going to be looking at a number of new frameworks and tools that will complement what we've been doing with the Regenerative Leadership Framework. And hopefully this will expand your understanding of both how to work on yourself and also how to continue to build your project towards that degree of sustainability wherever it is that you are actually operating. So we're going to be looking at, just a recap first, if you remember the definitions of the triple bottom line or the nested system of sustainability, which of course are critically important for you to understand that everything we do needs to consider at least these three dimensions of sustainability or regeneration. And of course, in the end, everything is geared towards developing overall well-being for the planet, for nature, for ourselves as a society, in that sort of attempt to create that balance and that harmony that would allow us to thrive as a species into the future indefinitely. We've watched, or asked you to watch last week, of course, the story of Majora Carta and the greening of the ghetto, and Majora's leadership and her model, her style, is, I think, extremely valuable in making the regenerative leadership framework visible and manifesting it as a personal translation of what these qualities, values, attributes, and behaviors can look like in real projects such as hers. And how does this translate to what you are doing? And that is why I emphasize the importance of what is your story and how do you make your story come alive. So we'll be discussing this as we get into week 3. Finally, to recap, we've spoken about tone, particularly in week 1. We talked about the difference between the tone of the sustainability leader, the conventional one, who works from a more moral, ethical, responsibility perspective, versus the regenerative leader that we propose has a more positive, aspirational perspective and tone. The importance of that tone where we inspire and engage through motivating from the inside out, not based on fear or guilt or remorse or anger, but based on the emotions of idealism, of optimism, of hope, of love, and of possibility for that abundance that is available to us all if we learn how to tap into it. So going from there, I'd like to suggest a couple of models that you can look at. The first one is about the nature of change and how we approach change. And in the regenerative leadership framework, of course, we've addressed the issue of triple loop learning and third order change. So where does this come from? Well, this model is based on the work of Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen. I'll be glad to share more about that if you're interested. And this particular model takes the work of Schoen and Argyris a little further in getting to triple loop learning. But that continuum is actually based on these 3 levels. And here is the first, where we look at single loop learning, or what we call the factory assembly model, which we can see not only in industry, but also in public education and other organizations that only look at results at the end of a process where those results are measured, such as the car in the factory, which comes out of the factory once assembled and is driven around the test track, and something happens, the wheels fall off, we realize that we didn't do the work right. We go back to the factory, we go back to that place in the assembly line where that car went wrong, the assembly, we fix that particular piece of the assembly, we start again, and now the car works. The assumption here is that everything is okay in the system. We just need to make sure that we fix things so that the next time around, things don't go wrong. And this is what we call doing things right. And you can see that in public schooling, for example, in state level testing, standardized testing, which is testing at the end of the cycle rather than during the cycle. So from this, we actually obtain first order change, where we don't question what we're doing, we just modify behaviors to make sure we obtain the results that we want. So moving further, when we get into double loop learning, we begin to realize that maybe some of our values and beliefs are not actually helping us do the things not only right, but doing the right things, as Warren Bennis actually tells us back in Management and Leadership of Organizations. So how do we know that we're doing the right things? Well, we need to begin to question some of the underlying assumptions of what we do in order to modify the behaviors, those behaviors even more, in order to accomplish better things. But even this, at the level of regeneration, doesn't get to the underlying reasons why we still have not been able to conduct ourselves in such a way that we can thrive indefinitely without risk. And this brings in this fundamental shift of our consciousness, of our mindset, towards this understanding not only of what we do, but also who we are, who I am in the context of my own work. And this is triple loop learning. The idea here that we not only need to make sure that we modify our behaviors to do things better and to do the right things, even from an ethical perspective, but we need to think more deeply into what is the absolute right thing to do and how should I be different in order to do things differently. This requires us to get into that deeper shift into the change of our own underlying consciousness and mindset in order to be able to do things differently. And that is what we call triple loop learning for third order change. So moving along. The implication here is that if we can actually go through this process of internal transformation and further enlightenment, we can begin to take a look at our organizations and what they look like and how they operate. So for example, in the case of the ProSheet Change Management Maturity Model, we can see, in this case, 5 different levels at which our organization might be operating. And you can read this for yourself, so I'm not going to go through this. You can stop and go through the slide here for yourselves. But you can see from a level 1 where projects are ad hoc, they're fragmented, they're isolated, and people do things without actually connecting across the organization, where failure is almost absolutely guaranteed, particularly at an organizational level. To at the top, where everything we do in the organization is actually brought together in a cohesive vision, strategy, and manifestation of that strategy in ways that actually are coherent and congruent. And so that particular framework, this particular framework, lens, can help us see where we are in terms of the maturity of our organization. And of course, you can see more here at the website of the ProSheet Management organization. Then what does that look like in the public sphere when we look at government? So if you're working at the level of municipality, how does that municipality, that city, that government actually involve its constituents? And so this is where we look at stakeholder engagement, which of course we have put in to quadrant 2 of the Regenerative Leadership Framework as the importance of multiple stakeholder engagement. So how do civic organizations or public government at the municipal, city, state, or federal level engage their voters, their residents, or whoever it is that they should be serving? And again, I won't read the whole slide, but you can look at it for yourselves to look at where are you, if you are in municipalities, or if you're working with municipal government or other types of government, where do you see their capacity to engage their residents, their constituents? Is it from this level of just informing the public to all the way at the other end of the spectrum, where you're actually placing the decisions to be made in the hands of the public, saying, we will implement what you decide, which is risky and can be quite scary and challenging for those in power to go that far down. But again, this continuum is of interest as a model to take a look at where you might be considering the level and the quality of participation of constituents, residents, those who will be affected by any decisions that you or that organization at the government level is actually making. So how does this all happen? Well, the proposal here is everything that we do is managed by the kinds of conversations that we engage in. And what I'm going to show you here are 4 levels or 4 fields of conversations that Otto Schama proposes, and how these actually support or undermine the quality of the work that we do and the decisions that we make and how we accomplish them, and how strong the potential is of our decisions to actually become regenerative in practice. So I'm going to be showing you 4 different types of conversation. And here you'll see the 4 fields I've placed here in the slide, these 4 quadrants, where you see looking at everything that we do, but from the models of the past, and where we actually fragment and divide things into parts, rather than being able to see the whole and being able to look at that possible ideal future. So these are the concepts that we will see in the 4 quadrants, in the 4 fields of conversation. So very often when we meet people for the first time, you will notice that we tend to talk nice. We're tactful and diplomatic. We're polite. We're cautious. We don't actually engage too much. We introduce ourselves, but we maintain our communication very much at the informal level and without getting into any kind of controversy. However, as soon as the agenda comes out, if there is one, we tend to begin to see that there are other interests at the table. And when that happens, of course, we can tend to go into defense mode and into attack mode, where we defend our own interests and the interests of the people that we respond to, because this is what we must take back to our constituency. We need to take back a win for our people. And this makes it very difficult for us to actually create something new. If we can get beyond these 2 forms of conversation and get into the next mode, it is possible that we can get into beginning to see the bigger picture, beginning to see that somebody says something that I can listen to and say, that's interesting, that is new, I had not heard that before, I need to know more. And we can begin to get into this idea of active listening and iterative observation, which we've also mapped out in the regenerative leadership framework, where we begin to change our own point of view to actually incorporate the points of view of others in order to create a bigger possible picture, and therefore a way forward that actually is shared rather than self-interested and responsive to my agenda and the agenda of my group. And even this might not get to the level of regeneration. We propose that for general dialogue, generative dialogue, and regeneration to become possible, we need to actually go further into this incorporation of all human faculties, not just the rational and the logical, but the imagination, intuition, creativity, not just the capacity to innovate, but to create entirely new ways that can only emerge if we can be in the present moment together at the time that we ask the question, what is it that we really want to accomplish? What is our aspiration? And how do we manifest that aspiration into actual work? And this is not an easy, shall we say, dialogue to accomplish, but we need to learn as facilitators of dialogue and meetings and organizations, how do we create the atmosphere in meetings in order to make this kind of dialogue possible? And that is the big challenge. And that is where your leadership style and behavior will actually promote or not allow for this kind of conversation to take place. So one of the big challenges about how to facilitate dialogue is to move away from conventional models of operation. So here we're going to take a look at appreciative inquiry and to contrast that with the traditional model of how we solve problems in organizations. Indeed, as you can see here on the left, we tend to approach our challenges with a problem-solving lens. We see that there is a need, there's a problem, we identify it, we analyze the causes, we generate a strategy, which is the possible solutions, we have an action plan, we implement it, and then we measure the results. And hopefully the results are closer to helping us solve the problem. But the assumption here underlying this approach, this mindset, is that the organization is a problem to be solved. And what it tends to do is it reduces the organization to a single issue, a single problem, where we attempt to solve that problem, and very often create more problems as a side effect or as a collateral effect of the decisions we made with regard to this isolated problem that we fragmented from or separated from the whole. So appreciative inquiry, which is completely different to that approach, actually begins with selecting an aspiration, something that we want to create in our organization. And we define that aspiration from a positive perspective by actually appreciating where are we, what are our strengths, not our problems, what are our values, what are the things that we are doing well together that actually make sense to us and are meaningful and purposeful in our organizations. And from here, we actually define in our dream this idea of the collective vision of what could we make happen, what could be our desirable future. And again, we put that into the regenerative leadership framework as our backcasting strategy about what is our desirable future. And this idea of the attribute of regenerative leaders, what is my capacity to actually envision a desirable final objective or goal as a future for my organization, for my family, for my community, for society as a whole. And from there, we design these provocative propositions. What should we do in order to accomplish that vision, which is shared? And then we unleash this idea of self-organized innovation, which I'll be talking about next week. But the basic assumption here is the organization is a mystery to be embraced as a whole, not as a problem to be solved. So moving on, and again, I'm not going to read all of this slide, I'm just going to introduce it. The idea of the difference between the bad or the wrong way to go about sustainability here on the left, and how each of these 7 blunders of sustainability and sustainable leadership can be addressed more positively here on the right by changing the approaches on the left to the approaches on the right. So this is something for you to think about, to read and reflect on, to see how you are operating in your own organization, your own work, and how you connect with others. So moving on, the way we design our projects in our organization, this is very important for how you will design your project, not just the project for the course here with me, but also going forward into the future. And here we're going to be looking at the next 2 slides at 2 approaches to the design of projects. The conventional one, which is here, the idea that we do things in a linear way, where we identify the project topic or the model or whatever it is that we're going to do. This is what I want to do. Then we have a conversation with the first person we need to talk to. In this case, the model is built around obviously construction, but it could be about an education program. It could be about a business model, a business project. It could be about a environmental thing. It could be about a community project to help alleviate poverty or suffering, or even addressing issues related to COVID and the pandemic. So in the linear model, the facilitator, the project leader, brings in the first person to talk to, who then brings in the next person to talk to, and so on down the line. And the problem with this particular approach is in linear models, we do not understand the full scope of the project until it reaches the user, the end user, who then comes up with a number of problems identified with the way that the project has actually been put together. In a integrated design process or model, where we look at things like circular industry or circular economies, we actually have a completely different approach, which basically places the project leader or facilitator at the center of the whole design process. And as we've been talking about before, the idea here is that the project is actually designed from the beginning with everybody who is going to be either a creator or a user of that product, that service, that program at the design table. So the decision making is actually done with the participation of all of the participants. This is what we call multiple stakeholder engagement in the regenerative leadership framework in quadrant 2. So in this case, again, we're talking about green construction, sustainable construction, where the client who maybe hires you, the facilitator, to actually create the process for design, actually you will then work with the client in bringing in all of these different people, all the way from the architect, the project manager, the contractor, the commissioning agent who oversees the project, any consultants that you need, and then external people like the community groups that are going to be reviewing the work, environmental evaluation or auditors, community impact groups, everybody who might have something to do, and the users, you bring them in to the design process. So if you're building a community center and you want to make sure that people with disabilities can access, whether they have problems with mobility or they're blind or deaf, do you consult with these at the beginning to make sure that that building is accessible and attractive to anybody who might not have all the use of all of their faculties? So this is the mindset in the design process. And here are some models, which again, I'm not going to go through them bit by piece, but here you have a type of organization, if you're looking at a school or a university, that actually considers that circular design process with all the different elements. So if you're designing an education program at any level of education, this is a model that might be helpful. The same happens here with business. I'm going to walk you through this one rather quickly, but then you can stop and read it and digest it. You can actually pick up the book that I've cited at the bottom. In a business model, thinking about how to create a business, and you can apply this to a non-governmental organization as well, adapting it, even though I'll show you a model in a minute. Here we have another 4-quadrant model where we look at what is happening today and what will be happening in the future, what is happening inside the organization, and what is happening or will be happening outside the organization. So in these 4 quadrants, in order for an organization to become effective and successful today and into the future as a sustainable or regenerative organization, what are the elements of each of these quadrants that need to be considered or are being considered? So here on the left, and in order the 4 quadrants, we're going to be looking at those things that drive the behaviors of the organization. So today, big corporations and industries look at things that drive them, such as pollution, the consumption of materials, the waste they generate, and the strategy in order to address these. They look at obviously preventing pollution, reducing their waste, going carbon neutral in terms of emissions, going zero waste to landfill if they can, doing everything that they can to minimize waste and their operational emissions. What is the payoff? That they reduce cost and they reduce risk. So the idea here at the most basic level is, can we bring down our costs, maximize our profits? Can we reduce the risks that we're running out of raw materials? For example, companies like Apple, who actually create electronics using rare metals and materials that are getting increasingly more difficult to actually extract from the Earth's crust. So they're trying to really not only recycle, but upcycle. So what are the external drivers of an organization like this in society, in the consumer? Well, today, civil society is far more powerful because of social media. There's much more transparency as to what a company does truly in terms of its social impact, its environmental impact, and its financial practices, economic practices. Everybody's much more connected. So therefore, any company today that is aware of how transparent society is today and how much more access people have must take care of how they take care of their product development or their service development. They must be good stewards. They must show that they are seriously committed to actually improving the quality of their products and the quality of the materials they put into their products in order to protect the health of their customers and their clients, and also to make sure that customers can buy their product knowing that those products have been created from sustainable sources. And so there is an interest in having stakeholders actually participate. And that's why we receive so many surveys and consultations from companies asking for our opinion on their products and services. And so the payoff here, of course, is greater reputation. This is what companies look for, and legitimacy in the eye of the consumer. So what does this look like into the future? The drivers of the future internally in organizations are this idea of disruptive technology. Can we create clean, new technology? Can we reduce our footprint? And so the strategy is, of course, to develop clean technologies that are as environmentally light in terms of their footprint, in order for people also to learn what we call these sustainable competencies of the future. What is it going to be like for our workers to be skilled at being sustainable? And the strategy, of course, has a payoff, which is being able to be continually innovating and repositioning ourselves in the market so that we can keep our market share. And this is something that companies in the technology space are very concerned about as we go into cloud computing. Social media is evolving very quickly. There is much more regulation coming into the political and economic spheres as we see greater regulation at government level of companies like Facebook and Apple, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the external drivers in the future? Well, clearly climate change has now left the sphere of the elite. It has now become mainstream. We see just too much climate change impacts throughout the world for us to ignore it. And this is now becoming major policy issues at the government level, not just at the level of corporations. So corporations will need to really get their act together if they're going to be competitive in the future. So this idea of becoming climate neutral even is insufficient. So into the future, for the customer base, companies are going to actually be bringing out this idea of going climate negative. Can we actually capture carbon and other emissions like methane out of the atmosphere in order to create the corporations that are actually going to drive change that will help heal the planet and obviously nature? And we must address not just the environmental issues involved with the climate change issues, but also things like environmental justice, reduction of poverty. How can we give access to everybody around the world to education, to technology, to business opportunities and job opportunities that can help everybody on the planet actually live a meaningful and purposeful life? And this idea is how to create this shared roadmap, a vision to meet those needs that have not been met for the world's poor and not just for the world's wealthy. How do we close the economic gap? And of course, the payoff for corporations is this idea of the sustainable growth trajectory. And so moving on, here is another framework, in this case, another circular design framework for community work. So if you're working in communities, how do you actually create communities that respect all of these different elements with regard to how you build through this circular design or integrated design process, the engagement of all the constituents in your community in order to build a project or a service or a program that considers the needs of the people who will be receiving the benefits of these projects or services from the design stage right at the beginning. And so here we have what I've called and created as the regenerative strategy cycle. Again, I'm not going to go through it part by part, but as you develop your project, think about how the different phases that you need in order to create a good project can actually be developed in order, like this, by steps. And we have these 5 steps, and I'll be glad to talk about this more in our live sessions. In order to answer the question, which is your project, what is the most important change you want to make? And the process, which is where I will make my greatest emphasis and focus in this course, is on the process for you to achieve what you want to do, which is how do you get everybody that should be involved in your project, program, or process, whatever it is, in order that they become really committed and engaged and empowered to be a part of that project. So this is how you create your team, or at least one way. Nothing is perfect. So you, as the change agent or regenerative leader, whether you're working outside of an organization or within an organization, you do need to create that internal team of like-minded thinkers who will be there with you all the way. In order for them and you to be then able to go out with the larger organization or outside with the external stakeholders in order to create the change that you want to make. So how do you get started? Again, I'm not going to read all of this. Here is a suggested list, and some instructions or directions about how to get this going. So again, looking at process, how do you do that? So stop the slide, take a look at this, read it, and then come to the live session. We can discuss in greater depth. I'm going to finish here with just, again, we pay so much attention, or we highlight the importance of systems thinking so much, but we don't really understand very often how complex systems are and how complex it is to actually make change in systems unless we understand their dynamics. So in this slide, you'll see a number of different levels and types of systems thinking, and how we can go from the very static sort of being able to model, create a map of a system, which is easy enough. We can do that on a 2-dimensional piece of paper, but it's not the same as actually generating, for example, at the more sophisticated level, computer models which can actually act and translate actual dynamics within a system to predict the effects over time of things that we do in our design process and then our implementation. So this is just a suggestion of some of the complexities within systems that we might want to consider if we're going to really adopt systems thinking as one of the tools that we use in order to be able to approach change and make effective change happen. And we're going to be looking at this next week in greater depth. So don't worry about trying to handle all of this. And all of this comes from the work of Alan Atkinson and these particular frameworks, which I'm not going to be sharing with you, except for as a reading next week with the sustainability pyramid, which is a process for developing other facilitators, like for creating a workshop, which can actually involve up to about 64 people, as you see here, in developing a sustainability pyramid, which I'm not going to go into the details now. You can do the reading. We can talk about that in greater depth, and you can see more information here at the at Alan Atkinson's website. So with that, I'm going to close here, and hopefully you will find this useful, and I look forward to our live session later in the week.